You can spend a lifetime trying to understand yourself. You can read all the books on self-knowledge, do years of therapy, move to another city, job, relationship, and even so, continue to feel trapped in the same standards, the same emptiness, the same pains that never seem to leave you. But what if I told you that nothing will really change until you understand one fundamental thing about your relationship with your mother? It sounds simple, even cliché. But according to Carl Jung, one of the biggest names in depth psychology, there is a crucial point in this connection that almost no one realizes. And ignoring this can keep you stuck in cycles of self-sabotage, neediness, anxiety, and even psychosomatic illnesses. What Jung discovered about the influence of the mother goes far beyond childhood. It shows how this figure shapes not only our personality, but also the way we relate to the world, to others, and mainly with ourselves. If you've ever felt like you're stuck in life, that you can't move forward even though you've tried everything, then this video is for you. And if you are looking for content that really makes you think, I invite you to subscribe to the channel right now. Here we go deep, without superficiality, without magic formulas, just reflections that transform. Now, take a deep breath and prepares. Because what you hear next can change the way you see not only your mother, but your entire story. Let's get started. From our first moment of life, even before we know what the world is, we already feel its presence. The mother, not just as the woman who gave birth to us, but as the first great psychic force that shapes our experience of reality. Carl Jung understood this figure much more deeply than the simple image of the caring woman or the provider. For him, the mother represents an archetype, a kind of universal mold that inhabits the collective unconscious. In other words, we are not only dealing with our biological mother, but with everything she represents in symbolic terms: nutrition, protection, upbringing, and also control, fear, abandonment, and shadow. This ambiguity is essential, because the same figure who cares for it can also suffocate. The same one that welcomes can imprison. And it is at this point that many wounds begin to form, even if imperceptible. During childhood, the mother's gaze is the mirror where the child learns to see himself. If this mirror reflects approval, security, unconditional love, the child grows up with a sense of belonging and value. But if this reflex is distorted, absent, or excessively demanding, the child develops wounds that extend into adult life in more subtle ways. Fear of rejection, low self-esteem, constant need for validation, difficulty in imposing or trusting oneself. And the scariest thing? Many times we don't even realize it. We just feel that something is wrong. That something pulls us back, like an invisible chain. We sabotage ourselves at decisive moments, choose partners who repeat family patterns, run away from intimacy, or become emotionally dependent, without understanding why. According to Jung, all this happens because we do not integrate this archetype of the mother within us. In other words, the image we have of our mother lives outside of us, controlling us unconsciously. And as long as this figure remains external, loaded with sorrows, idealizations, or frustrations, we will continue to be hostages of his influence. This does not mean that it is your mother's fault, much less that you should confront it, judge it, or walk away from it. Jung would never point the finger in this sense. What he proposes is something much more liberating: to bring the image of the mother into consciousness. To look at this figure with maturity, with compassion, but also with lucidity. Seeing the mother as a human being, with her own pains, limitations, and unresolved stories, and no longer as an idealized deity or a villain responsible for all our problems. This process requires courage, because many times, recognizing our mother's flaws is touching on pains that we have avoided all our lives. It is to open wounds that were dormant, but that have never ceased to influence us. However, only then is it possible to truly grow. Only in this way can we become whole adults, capable of self-responsibility, loving freely, and building our own identity, detached from family expectations and projections. The healing journey begins when we stop waiting for our mother to give us something that she may never have been able to give, because she didn't even receive it herself. And it is at this point that the transformation begins to happen. Because when the mother figure stops being a ghost from the past and becomes an integrated image, she stops controlling us. But for this, it is necessary to understand what it means, in practice, to integrate this archetype. And more than that, recognize the signs that we are still stuck in the shadow of the mother, without even realizing it. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about now. You may be living under your mother's shadow without even realizing it. Not because she wanted to harm you or because you don't love her, but because the unconscious influence she has on your life has yet to be recognized. And everything that is not recognized controls you. Jung explained that the maternal archetype has two faces, the one that feeds and the one that devours. The loving and welcoming mother, but also the mother who suffocates, manipulates, projects her fears and frustrations onto her child. When this maternal shadow is not seen, it remains active within us. And then, even as adults, we carry within our psyche the weight of unfulfilled expectations, poorly healed wounds, and behaviors that we cannot explain. You may have a hard time making decisions on your own. He always seeks the approval of others, especially female or authority figures. Or maybe you feel guilty for walking away, for wanting to be different, for not living up to what was expected of you. As if any step toward his freedom was a silent betrayal. These feelings do not usually arise from the present. They come from an emotional past that has never been understood. And until this is brought to light, we repeat cycles. We enter relationships where we feel small, we attract people who control us, we constantly feel exhausted from trying to be perfect, nice, always too good. Another common sign is the feeling of emptiness, even when everything seems to be right in life. You can have a good job, friends, even a stable relationship, but something inside you remains incomplete. It is as if there were an absence that fills nothing. And often, this absence is the symbolic reflection of an emotional need that was not met back then. To be seen, accepted, validated as you really are, and not as they thought you should be. Jung said that integrating the maternal shadow is fundamental for true individuality to flourish. This means looking at everything that the mother figure represents, love, yes, but also pain, with honesty. It is not about looking for culprits, but about understanding the deep mechanisms that have shaped the way they feel, react, and protect themselves in the world. Sometimes healing begins simply by allowing yourself to feel anger or sadness for your mother without guilt. Recognize that there were failures, that there was excess or absence, and that this had an impact. Validating these emotions is the first step to breaking free from the invisible prison they create. Because while you repress what you feel, the pain becomes the standard. But when you look at it head-on with awareness, it begins to dissolve. And this process is liberating. You begin to realize that you no longer have to repeat the same stories. Who can make choices for themselves, build new paths, relate in healthier ways, without carrying the emotional baggage of an unresolved childhood. The mother's shadow only loses strength when it is illuminated. When we stop acting by instinct and start responding with awareness. When we stop looking in adult life for what was missing back then and start giving ourselves what we never received. And that's precisely where a new phase begins. A phase where you stop being a reflection of pain and become the author of your own story. But for this to really happen, it is necessary to understand how this process of individuation that Jung talked about so much takes place. Because it is not enough just to identify the patterns. It is necessary to cross them, transform them, and finally, overcome them. And it is about this crossing, and how it can change everything, that we will explore next. Jung called this process of liberation from the maternal shadow individuation. A word that may sound technical at first glance, but which, in fact, describes a profoundly human journey to become who you are beyond the masks, the conditionings, the inherited expectations. It is the path towards wholeness, reconnection with your most authentic essence. But beware, this path is not linear nor comfortable. On the contrary, it requires confronting everything that has been repressed or distorted within you. It's a process of stripping yourself of the stories you've been told and that you've come to believe about what you should be to deserve love. When we grow up under the unconscious influence of the mother figure, we often develop personas, versions of ourselves created to please, avoid conflict, or ensure acceptance. The good daughter, the strong son, the child who never complains. These identities become armor. And individuation, according to Jung, is precisely the act of taking off these armors, one by one, until only what is true remains. This process inevitably involves recognizing the projections. Because while we don't become aware of the impact of the mother figure, we continue to project it onto other people, the romantic partner, the boss, the friend, the therapist. We expect from these people what, deep down, we still want from our mother: attention, validation, unconditional affection, protection. The big turning point happens when you start to return those projections. When you stop waiting for the other to save you, understand you perfectly, or heal your wounds. And that doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means, in fact, taking responsibility for one's own internal world. To become the adult who cares for the wounded child that still lives inside you. Individuation is therefore a return to oneself. A reunion with parts of the soul that have been hidden by fear, shame, or guilt. And this reunion is only possible when we stop seeing the mother as the origin of everything, whether as a source of pain or an ideal of perfection, and start to see her as a starting point. It gave us life, yes, but what we do with that life is what really matters. This process of psychic maturation does not happen overnight. It requires silence, inner listening, courage to feel what has always been avoided. And most of all, it requires compassion. Because by integrating the mother figure within you, you also begin to look at her with more humanity. Not as the woman who failed, but as someone who was also a child, who also had her own pains, her own shadows. And that gaze, free from idolatry or resentment, is what ultimately sets you free. It frees you to love without fear, to create without repeating, to live without carrying burdens that are not yours. And that's where the real transformation begins, when you stop being an extension of your mother's story and start writing your own. Jung believed that healing does not come by trying to erase the past, but rather by illuminating the parts of it that are still at work in the present. And by doing so, you regain the power to choose. Choosing what to keep, what to transform, what to leave behind. And above all, who you want to be from now on. But the question that remains is, how to apply this in a practical way? How do you know if you have already started this process of individuation, or if you are still stuck in the unconscious image of the mother? And what are the real steps that can help you move forward on this journey? That's exactly what we're going to explore in the next part. Because understanding is the first step. But experiencing this transformation, in practice, is what really changes everything. Understanding is necessary, but acting from this understanding is what brings true transformation. The journey of individuation, as Jung described, is not only made up of intellectual perceptions. It happens in everyday life, in silent decisions, in small breaks with old patterns, and, mainly, in the construction of new ways of relating to oneself and the world. So how to begin, in practice, to free oneself from the unconscious influence of the mother figure? The first step is to observe your emotional triggers. What situations destabilize you easily? Which people seem to touch old wounds? Often, the most intense reactions, such as disproportionate anger, sudden sadness, or a sense of abandonment, are not about the present, but about the unworked past. And often, these emotions are directly linked to dynamics learned in childhood from the mother. The second step is to develop an internal space for listening. This means cultivating moments of introspection, whether through writing, meditation, or therapy, where you can identify the inner dialogues you carry. That critical voice that calls you inadequate, that demands perfection, that says you can't make mistakes, it is often an echo of the internalized mother figure. It is not a matter of fighting this voice, but of recognizing it and little by little, replacing it with a more adult and compassionate voice. A voice that welcomes, that validates, that guides with love, like the mother you may not have, but who can now learn to be for yourself. Another essential point is to question invisible loyalties. Many people, without realizing it, live limited by silent emotional pacts with their mother, as if following a different path were an act of disloyalty. This manifests itself when you feel guilt growing up, prospering, being happy in areas where your mother was unhappy. As if his happiness were a kind of betrayal. Breaking away from that is not rejecting your mother. It is recognizing that you have the right, and the duty to live your own story. That honoring your origin is not repeating your pains, but transcending them. Additionally, it's important to look at the relationship patterns you attract. If you always get involved with people who are controlling, cold, overly needy, or demanding, you may be repeating the emotional dynamics you had with the mother figure. Identifying this pattern is the beginning of healing. Change requires awareness, clear boundaries, and sometimes even a time of solitude, so you can listen to yourself before trying to fit back into the external world. Another practical exercise is symbolic visualization. Imagine that you stand in front of your mother, whether she is alive or not, and symbolically give her everything that is not yours to carry: guilt, expectations, fears, demands. Be grateful for life, recognize what you were able to receive, but take your part. This practice, when done sincerely, has a profound effect on the unconscious and can make room for a new perception of oneself. And, above all, practice self-acceptance. That's the basis of everything. Don't wait any longer for someone to come and fill the void that was left. Learn to offer yourself what you lacked: presence, kindness, care. It doesn't happen overnight, but with every conscious choice, every moment you decide not to abandon yourself. This is the most powerful practice of individuation, to become whole on the inside, even if there are still fragments in the process of healing. Because when you become the source of your own love, your security, and your worth, the image of the mother is re-signified. It stops being an unconscious weight to become just what it is, a part of your story, no longer the complete script. And it is precisely at this point that a fundamental question arises. What happens when we finally free ourselves from this influence? What changes in our lives, in our relationships, and in the way we see the world? That's what we're going to understand below. When the unconscious influence of the mother figure is finally understood, elaborated, and re-signified, something begins to change in a very subtle, but profoundly powerful way. It is as if, little by little, the weight of the soul was being removed. Decisions become lighter, relationships more true, and the look at oneself becomes more loving, more whole. Because the truth is that, while we are under the domination of the non-integrated maternal image, we live as if we were always in debt. As if there were an emotional debt that is never paid. But when going through this process, this feeling begins to give way to a freedom that only those who have gone through this crossing can understand. You begin to realize that you can choose without guilt, that you can be different from your mother without that meaning rejecting her, that you can love without repeating, that can build something new without fear of breaking with the old. And this power does not come from arrogance, but from reconnection with your own essence. This transformation is reflected in all areas of life. In relationships, you stop looking for someone to fill a void and start opening up to healthier connections based on presence, reciprocity, and respect. At work, you gain the courage to express your authenticity rather than following paths that only exist to meet external expectations. Even health changes. Symptoms that came from the accumulation of repressed emotions can begin to disappear, as if the body finally feels that it is being heard. Liberation from the shadow of the mother is, above all, a process of reintegration of the self. When you understand that you are no longer that child who needs to mold yourself to be loved, something very valuable awakens within you, the sense of self-worth. And from there, life begins to flow differently. Insecurities continue to exist, of course. The pains do not disappear like magic. But now, there is a more solid inner center. You don't dismount yourself in the face of difficulties with the same ease. And when it dismantles itself, because that still happens, it already knows how to withdraw, how to welcome itself, how to rebuild itself. This is emotional maturity. This is individuation. Another powerful effect of this transformation is the compassion that is born not only towards the mother, but also towards the other women in her life, grandmothers, aunts, sisters, friends. You begin to see them beyond the roles, beyond the judgments. He begins to realize that everyone is, in some way, trying to deal with their own shadows, their own emptiness, their own stories. And just like that, the cycle of pain begins to break. By healing your inner relationship with the mother archetype, you also heal generations. because it fails to pass on what it has received without question. He stops repeating what he hurt. It stops silencing what needed to be said and makes room for a new way of existence. More conscious, freer, more loving. And perhaps this is one of the greatest contributions of Jung's thought. He shows us that we are not bound by what we have been given, that we are part of a story, yes, but also creators of it, and that by looking with courage at what hurts us the most, we can find precisely there the portal to our greatest strength. Now, after all this, perhaps an essential question remains: how to bring all this together in a practical and transformative vision? How to take the next steps consciously without getting lost in old patterns again? And how, finally, to conclude this journey with lightness and wisdom? That's exactly what we're going to explore in the last part. At the end of the day, the journey to break free from the mother's unconscious influence is not about cutting ties or erasing the origin. It is, first and foremost, about recognizing the impact that this figure had and still has within you and choosing what to do with it from now on. Along this path, you have seen how the maternal archetype silently acts in our behaviors, emotions, and choices. She understood that the shadow of the mother is not only manifested in the direct relationship with her, but also in the projections we make, in the unconscious loyalties we carry, and in the internal voices that dictate rules that we never question. He saw that liberation happens not by rejecting, but by integrating. Not by denying the pain, but by going through it with awareness. Jung taught us that we only heal when we become whole. And to become whole is to take on every part of oneself, including those that were born of lack, pain, and the unsaid. When you stop running away from these parts and start listening to them with presence, they stop screaming. And in the silence that forms afterwards, you can hear something new, your own voice. This voice had perhaps been buried for years under the layers of expectations, demands, repetitions. But it was always there. And now, at the end of this journey, it begins to gain space. It is the voice of your true self, of the conscious adult who looks back with respect, but moves forward with autonomy. What an honor the mother she had, but chooses to live the life she wants. The cure that Jung proposes is neither rapid nor linear. It is a process that requires courage, presence, and constancy. But the reward is immeasurable. Because when you integrate the mother figure within yourself, you don't just reconcile yourself with the past, you free yourself to live the present with more truth. You start to make choices that are more aligned with your essence. To build healthier relationships, without so much fear of abandonment or need for approval. He starts to see himself with more compassion. To allow yourself to make mistakes, to change your mind, to start over. And above all, to feel at peace with who you are. This journey does not end here. In fact, it has only just begun. But now you carry tools, reflections, and above all awareness. And with awareness, everything is transformed. If this content resonated with you, please share it. Perhaps someone close to them is also trapped in an invisible cycle and needs to hear these words. And if you want to continue exploring topics like this, subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't offer ready-made answers, but ways for you to discover your own. Because in the end, you'll never heal until you understand this about your mother. But when he understands, something inside you finally breaks free. And it is in this space that true healing begins.